I first read this comic more than 30 years ago. And in the years since then, I've returned to it many times, and it has persisted in being one of my favorite single issues of all time. Now, of course, a lot of this has to do with nostalgia, how long ago I read it, how young I was then, how little I had read at that point of time. But there are those things that one is nostalgic about, especially works like songs or comics, movies from our childhood that really hold up to adult scrutiny. And I think there's a very good reason for that, because I think there are certain things that we are nostalgic about, not only because we remember the time at which we first encountered them, but because those things became such building blocks in our adult sensibilities. So, of course, they hold up to adult scrutiny. Adult scrutiny, in part, is because of these works. These are the works that taught us what to appreciate, what we like, why we like them. And this comic, for me, is a prime example of that. This is a comic that, within its 23 pages, transformed the way I read comics, the way I understood them, the way they appealed to me, and transformed what I expected from them. In part, this was because of the plotting and the dialogue by Marv Wolfman, but over the years, I've come to realize just what a significant role the art plays in making the story as memorable and as foundationally instructive as it is. The art by George Pérez that honestly, for the rest of my life, influenced my expectations from comic storytelling. So I'd like to highlight a couple of the things that I really love to this day about this comic, and I also try to articulate a couple of the things that it changed within me as a reader. Also, I had a sort of game in which I shared a tiny little section of one panel online and asked people to guess which comic this was. And at the end of this video, I'll share a couple of those responses with you. But right now, let's dive into New Teen Titans number 18 by Marv Wolfman and George Pérez, one of my favorite single issues of all time. The cover of number 18 is fine, I guess. It's not a spectacular cover, but I'm not really that attached to the cover, and that's because there was no cover attached to the copy that I read when I was a kid. It was one of those coverless copies that you could pick up on the street. I suspect these might have been issues from US comics shops that were supposed to be pulped, but in any case, I only found the cover of this comic much, much later, so it wasn't part of my appreciation, and honestly, it's not really representative of the story inside, except at the more superficial level. But the first page is a crackerjack first page, and I think works wonderfully as a cover for me. That's always the way I've known this story. There are 3 long panels that say, what do a comet plunging into Siberia, a violent revolution in El Salvador, and a young Russian bride-to-be have in common? The amazing answer is in A Pretty Girl is Like a Malady. I had no idea about the song lyric or a song title, A Pretty Girl is Like a Melody, but I did understand it was a pun and appreciate that. This is a standalone story. It works perfectly fine for someone who hasn't been reading the series or honestly even knows the Teen Titans, which was certainly the case for me. I had no idea about any of the superheroes other than Robin in this comic when I first read it, but there is that thing at the top that tells you who the cast members are and what their powers are, and that's really all you need to get into this story. But then you have the hook of this page, which is not a splash but 3 panels, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later. Then we quickly get the story of a Russian man who gets the bad news of his son being killed by an American in El Salvador. So we immediately get the answer to one of the questions that was asked on the first page, one of the elements. Here's with the El Salvador connection. And this grieving father blames Americans for so many tragedies in his life and decides to take revenge by unleashing this secret research bioweapon on the United States. For this, he gets his unsuspecting assistant to travel to New York, carrying a package that has already irradiated her with this virus. And she agrees because she feels bad for him and wants to do things to make him feel better, but she would rather be with her fiancé because she is getting married in a month. So here's the second connection. A young bride-to-be is the person who's being sent to the US as a carrier of this virus. Then the narrative flashes forward a week to Robin and Wonder Girl meeting an FBI agent, King Faraday, on the docks, who lets them know about a Russian superhero, Starfire, that they had earlier encountered, who seems to be making his way to the United States in secret. Wonder Woman recalls their previous encounter with this superhero. They'd fought on the same side and parted friends, and she also helpfully recaps for us this superhero, Starfire's origin story of how a meteor that had crashed in Siberia turned out to be a spaceship and granted him powers through an electrical accident. And we as our readers have our third connection, Russia's only superhero. In a team meeting, we get the rest of the Titans, including Starfire, someone who shares her name with this Russian superhero, and Kid Flash, Wally West, who is a very gung-ho US patriot and very anti-commie, and comes across as definitely very suspicious and untrusting of the Russians. 3 days later, in JFK, we see the arrival of Maladi from Russia to the United States and immediately see her irradiating, infecting people that she's coming into contact with. A week after that, Starfire arrives incognito at the same airport, encounters a security guard who had been there a week earlier and watches him collapse. He understands that the virus has already started taking effect, but he is also being observed by a green fly, the changeling, who reports to his teammates. It's that as soon as this Russian guy arrived, a security guard dropped dead, which makes Wally immediately jump to the conclusion that he's the weapon that they're worried about, the thing that the FBI agent had told them about, and they rush to the hospital where the security guard's been taken to try and find out more about this. The superhero Raven goes into the hospital, gets some information on how dangerous this is, and now the Titans are on a stakeout. They don't know anything about Malady, so they're watching the Russian Starfire. Then we get a sequence in which he's finally closing in on this woman, and the elevator doors close just as soon as he sees her, and the watching Titans see him in superhero form come bursting through the walls, immediately take that as an attack, and then we get a really nice action scene, one of my favorites really, in which they all gang up on Starfire, but he holds his own against them. But they're not trying to really put him down, which gives him a little bit of an advantage, but finally he is captured and interrogated, where he reveals that this woman has been infected as a revenge plot, and he's there to prevent it from becoming an international incident by taking care of this quietly. Wally, of course, is completely suspicious about this, and there's a little bit of a political debate, but the fact that they won't trust him and he has a mission to do anyway makes Starfire attack them, and he escapes from Teen Tower. Then we go to a sequence at a doctor's where Malady, completely emaciated and unrecognizable from how we've seen her before, is obviously in some sort of the last stages of this illness, but still has to finish her mission because she has to get back home for her wedding. So she leaves from the doctor's place with directions to where she needs to go, ignoring her condition. At the cloisters, we find Malady waiting for the New York contact that her boss told her to hand over the envelope to, and instead she's faced by Starfire. And when she asks him what he's doing there, he says he's there to see that she dies. This is all Kid Flash needs to hear. Apparently the Titans are here and they start attacking him, having gotten the proof that he is, after all, an instrument of the Russian government and an assassin. Here we have another fight sequence between Starfire and some of the Titans while Robin and Raven try to tend to Malady. This is one of those fight sequences in which the argument and the fighting are taking place in parallel. Wally continues to berate the communist government politics of Russia, and Starfire is arguing and fighting back, saying it's not about politics and this is the only way that this situation can be handled. While the fight continues, Raven tries but fails to be able to heal or take care of Malady, just stabilizing her a little bit. And after even more fighting and even more argument and back and forth, the Teen Titans are finally able to physically subdue the Russian Starfire. He still tries to get up and finish what he's there for, but the Titans stand in his way and say that no, they're going to take her to a doctor, even though the Russian Starfire says there's nothing anyone can do for her, which turns out to be true on the next page as Malady passes away. There is one final argument in the hospital doctor's lobby where Kid Flash again berates him of how he could have thought of to put her down like a dog, and what kind of human is he. And it comes out that Starfire had volunteered for for this mission, which makes Wally even more furious, and he asks for what? A medal when you get home? And that's when Starfire says no, because he loved her, they were engaged to be married, and this was the day of their wedding. And then we're left with one panel in which we see none of the characters really, just the back of Starfire's head through a door window as he walks away, and the shadows of the Titans on the door. So why did I and why do I continue to love this story so much? Well, that's what it is. It's the story. I thought it was a great story, and I think it's a great story. But what I mean by story has changed over the years, and this comic is one of those instrumental comics that helped me understand what I mean by story isn't just plot or even writing. Which is not to say plot and writing doesn't play a big part of why I love this comic so much. I love the tense setup of working against the clock to stop this, but also the different way in which it was managed. The vehicle being an innocent woman, and the life of that woman becoming the thing that these superheroes are arguing about. There was the political complexity because all sides of all arguments were coming across. Even the villain, I mean, they're obviously a villain, but you're empathetic to them. You understand that they're working out of grief and loss and things that are very human. I love the fact that I could read it standalone because it contained everything I needed to know about these people. And I love the fact that the characters, especially the superhero group, each member kind of got their moment to shine. And then there is the ending, which in some ways is a twist ending, but it isn't a twist ending that subverts everything that has come before it. Rather, like the best twist endings, it builds on the things and then sort of comments on the argument that's been going on. Irrespective of political differences, irrespective of the fact that actually both of these superhero groups, the Titans as well as the Russian Starfire, are working at the behest of their governments. In spite of all of those things, the one thing that the ending definitely says is that there isn't a superiority of humanity of one side over the other. That was one of the driving forces, not of just this story, but of superhero or hero stories in general. You've got to be on the right side. You've got to be doing the right thing. And the idea represented by Kid Flash is that the other side is less human. The other side is more cruel, more vicious. And that's what makes us right. Not just for young me, but for grown-up me. I think that's a terrific way to tell a complex story. But all of these things about the excellent writing weren't quite what I meant even as a child when I thought of this as a terrific story. I thought that it moved terrifically. I thought that it not only had great action, but it kept the story going. I could have moments of exposition and moments of debate and fight sequences that blended seamlessly. The way that pertinent information was shared with me shifted from page to page and sequence to sequence based on what I needed to get. What made it a good story was I was given all those things in exactly the way that was needed. And in reading and rereading this comic over the years, I realized that why the story was so powerful was the way the writing melded with the art and the layouts. The economy of the story, the pacing of the story, the narrative drive of the story was being as determined, if not more, by the art than the words on the page. Now, even in just 23 pages, there's a lot to point out in how it was doing this, but I found a couple of the highlights to be the long, elongated rectangular panels, the circular zoom insets, and the use of the multiple panel sequence rather than the single panel loaded with stuff, all of which transform the story to what it is. And what these techniques achieved, the biggest and the most significant difference they made to me as a comics reader, is that they made me realize that comic storytelling is best and most effective when it is about a sequence, when it isn't about a single panel, but rather all those panels put together on a page-by-page or sometimes two-page basis in order to achieve the effects the story wants to have. Maybe I'll do a better job explaining it by taking a look at some of my favorite examples. Right away, the first page. One of my favorite first pages. It's not a big splash. It's three long, narrow panels that feel like three splashes. And that's because of the careful arrangement of just those simple sentences. What do a meteor in Siberia, a revolution in El Salvador, a young bride-to-be have in common? But you've got these three long spaces, each of which make you feel that there's an entire story behind each of these lines, which there is and will be stories nested within this story that we're about to read. And immediately I know, even young me knows, that none of these panels by themselves mean what they mean together. The text obviously helps me, but I have to read all three of these together, understand that the weight of each might be the same even though they're so very different, and look at these three perfect images of people in spaces or just spaces and understand the breadth and the depth of the story I'm about to read. It's really a wonderful start, which is not just a trailer or a teaser for what you're about to see, but rather a puzzle that you will help put together in order to register the impact of the story. Subsequent pages also use these long vertical panels in order to fill out a scene with incredible economy. The conversation between Maladi and her boss is also in these strips, giving you the words and the expressions and a slow zoom, including our first look at this green glow around her hand, which is obviously not something visible to the characters of the story, but visible to us as the reader. And we feel this scene as an ominous and heavy scene in spite of its compactness on the page. Another great page is the one with the airport arrivals of both Maladi and Starfire a week apart. The horizontally elongated panel look at JFK Airport is repeated to give us the same scene with two different characters. And in between them, you've got a sequence of three long panels of Maladi encountering different people. Unlike the very first page, these are in sequence in the same person is being followed by a camera. But even though they're not jumping between locations and time, they are just still jump cuts in her movement, giving us this virus transmission in three quick blows. This, of course, owes a lot to the three circular insets we get, which are zoomed in images of the panels that we are seeing with that green glow, and we understand that that infection is passing from her to these people that she is touching or who are touching things that she is. This doesn't really need to be explained. Even to a young child reading this, what I am seeing is absolutely clear. It's not just the idea of zooming in on one part to give you a clearer view within that panel. It's the fact that these three panels establish that vocabulary and then exploit that vocabulary in order to do its storytelling as soon as it's taught it to you. That's what makes it so compact and effective. The second page of the first fight sequence between the Teen Titans and Starfire might be one of my favorite pages in all of comics. There are 5 horizontally elongated panels that make up this page, and each of these panels is dynamic and brilliant, but what makes this page fantastic is the way that they all work with each other. In the first approach panel, we can see that Starfire is crouched on the ground with his hands on the pavement, and the second panel gives us one of those circular insets, which we know is a zoom, but it isn't a zoom to an image we have already seen before. It's actually a zoom that continues that image, so we're not going into the image simultaneously the way that we were in the airport scene, but we're using that vocabulary to now progress it by like one frame or one moment, but not in a separate panel given to us as an inset, so it doesn't break the flow of the motion. We get to the next panel. The outer panel shows him ripping it off. Basically, what it shows is he's already ripped it off, but because of that quick inset zoom transition of him crunching it together, this motion, in my opinion, is absolutely flawless. Not content to rest on its laurels, the page continues with this sort of Dutch angle tilt, but it's not just to create unease or look stylish the way that it sometimes is. Wonder Woman is flying in from the top right, so it's as if the camera's tilting upwards as Starfire turns his neck to catch a glimpse of her. This is not a camera movement. We're not actually seeing motion, but Of course we are. It's definitely there without any motion lines. It's the angle and the way that this horizontal extension is used to frame these two characters in there. The very next panel is a narrow, borderless one, almost the exact same angle as you saw before, but it's adjusted downward a little flatter, just a little bit. And because of the quick motion lines on Starfire's left arm, as well as the changing angle of the taut lasso, we know that he has grabbed it and yanked it once again in a way that is absolutely clear. The fact that the camera, as it were, adjusts slightly to come to this new angle where he takes control, and then the next panel is absolutely at ground level as he smashes her down. Once again, these three panels put together are just amazing action. What the art has done here is created a hemisphere of space without actually drawing that circle for us. By changing the angle on these horizontal panels to exactly match the movement in the action, we get a grabbing and a yanking and essentially a 180-degree flip that isn't presented on paper, but we can see absolutely clearly. It's because of action like this that is so perfect in the physics that it manipulates my mind to see that I still, till today, find a lot of movie CGI action in superhero movies, etc., just they don't compare to what the comics do, because the comics are using my brain and using perfect manipulation of my brain to create movement that is very hard, if not impossible, to beat. And this page over here, with its kineticism and its terrific use of space and movement, is one of the prime examples why. Another thing that I've always loved has been Starfire's dive out of Titan Tower when he's escaping. Right at the top of the page, we have this wide shot, again, using an elongated horizontal panel. And what that establishes for us is not just the size of the tower, but also the geography related to the shore. This is used at the bottom of the page when we get these vertically narrow panels showing us this dive, and we're not actually seeing the full picture here. We're just seeing the arc as he heads to the water. But because we know how far away even the widest surface of the tower is from the shore, we have a very clear idea of how phenomenal a dive this is, even though what we're actually seeing in this one panel is a very tiny part of that arc. Being able to create this kind of space and this kind of action in which the reader is right there with you, being impressed by the things you want them to be impressed by without actually seeing it literally spelled out, this is what makes this comic and comics that do these things right so special. There's more clever use of zooms and the irradiated glow to create irony and a sense of doom within the reader. And again, some marvelously economical and super detailed artwork for the fight sequences. But really the last page and the ending, which initially might have been assigned to pure plot, like, oh, what a good plot, what a good twist. The last page is once again a great example of how comic storytelling relies on the page layout and the panel work. The death of Maladi is an interesting inversion. You do have an inset, but the inset is actually the establishing shot. So what you're seeing inside is what you see first, and then you go inside to the outside panel, a curious sort of reversal. But the last three panels with the declaration, the facial expressions, the perfect framing of the torsos is for sure a deliberate echo of the three panels that we have seen in the comics so far, but this giving us moment by moment close-ups, and then that final panel, which is not just silent and bereft of text or words, but it's bereft of faces and expressions, ones that have done such a good job selling their convictions or their arguments so far. They're all left out of it. And in spite of it not being a huge panel or a full page splash or a half page silent panel to really drive the point home, and this is a terrific choice because this is the right balance for this story. This silence is much louder because of its constrained nature. The full stop, the period that it gives to the story is a significant one because it isn't made bold and huge because it doesn't have those faces. The shadows and the silhouettes allow the reader to soak in not just what they just read in the previous panel, but all 23 pages before this, put it into new context, and really display the mastery that make the story as wonderful as it is. Before I wrap up, I did say at the beginning of the video that I'd share a couple of viewer comments with you. So I put this picture up on Instagram, Facebook, and the YouTube community post and asked people to guess what my next video was going to be on. Here's a couple of comments that I received. Ray Mescallado says, "The circular inset panel, the green glove, the dialogue, and the finely delineated rubble made me think of the new Teen Titans issue where the Russian Starfire returns. And I assume that's the coriander Starfire's hair, who's that brown jagged streak outside the circle. Even if I'm wrong, I'm pretty positive that's George Pérez art, although admittedly he's been on my mind a lot lately." Wow, Ray. Wow. Take a bow. Not to be outdone, Karthik Narayan also responded, "Artist, writer, Marv Wolfman and George Pérez. The New Teen Titans, issue number 18, story A Pretty Girl is Like a Malady, page number 12. That's MLA-worthy citation right there. Fantastic job, Ray and Karthik. I am honestly flabbergasted. And thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next one.